Hello, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with all you here today, talking about such an important subject as is child marriage. We want to start a conversation that helps us understand how we can know more about increases impact and how we can all work to end it. And for that, it is my absolute pleasure to have Nana Oyorti with us, Otu Oyorti with us. Nana, it's a pleasure always to have you and see you. But before we start, and trust me, we can go for ages. I do want to talk a little bit, give some kind of housekeeping rules for all of us, just for everybody who's starting to join this conversation. You're coming as a participant. You will find a question and answers section where you can start putting down your questions. We will really try to answer as many as we can, some with our team, some as we roll on within the conversation. But your microphone and camera are disabled at the moment. Also, this is a topic we'll be talking about: domestic violence, sexual violence, everything that goes around gender-based violence. So we understand the topic can be very sensitive. At the end, we will also be putting resources where people can go if this affects them in any way or need any help. So thank you all so much for starting to join this conversation. Now, I'm very excited to introduce you to Nana, but let me, I think we feel like we know you so well, the team knows you so well, Nana, but let me kind of give everybody a little bit of background. Nana is the executive director of Forward, which is a leading African diaspora women's rights organization in the United Kingdom, working to end multiple forms of violence against women and girls, including female genital mutilation. For over 30 years, Nana has championed gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights for African women and girls at multiple levels. She's a passionate advocate for ending child marriage, child motherhood, and nurturing young women's leadership development and well-being. Nana was born in Ghana and has a master's in philosophy from Sussex University in development, and she received her MBE in 2009. She is a board member of the Gender and Development Network and a co-founder of the END FGM European Network. Nana, let's start as I was telling you before, I know that we have so many activists, some of them, young people that are coming and starting to kind of, walk this pathway of leadership within the gender-based violence space. Tell us a little bit about you, how you started. What was it that made you walk this path, and really what keeps you going?
Hello, Pamela, and hello to the audience who joined us in this first learning session, I would say. Really talking about my journey to working on this area. It's a long journey. It didn't start when I was in Forward. I suppose it started when I was in university, because we had I would say a circle of concerned young women at a time when gender issues was not even mentioned, but we knew there were issues around women's inequality and girls not having voices and not having rights. And we had a mentor who was a university lecturer at the time, and she gave us space and time to start engaging on these issues. So it made me very much conscious of the fact that I had a voice and I could make a change. But also, I also came from a background where I lived with my stepmother. I never lived with my dad. So I actually knew right from the beginning that issues were in my home wasn't right. And I was very conscious about my mom had made the decision to, divorce my dad and remarry. And at a time when it was really taboo to do those things. So it was really very much like I had a hero at home. So it was really important for me to lend my voice. And right from university, I remember when I finished university, I was asked to be a lecturer, or to continue to be, an assistant lecturer. But I chose to rather go into the field to go and work on women and with women doing agriculture. And that's how I really started my activism on gender and rights, and found that I had a space, I had a voice, and I had an interest. Since then, I have worked on women in empowerment. I've worked on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And in the last 20 years, we have, and the work I've done has actually focused very much on tackling female genital mutilation. But we realized that it was very much linked. Wherever we went in Africa, we saw that female genital mutilation was very much linked to child marriage. You know, a woman goes through FGM shortly afterwards she gets married, and forced into marriage and made to marry, well, you know, and we realized that this was an issue. So coming into Forward, that really nurtured my interest in continuing this kind of activism. And Forward was an organization that gave me space, gave me the opportunity to really go and go for it and undertake some of these activism. And I think for a number of organizations, they have, you know, barriers, and being in a leadership position, I think you have the decision-making power to make change and to speak out on taboo issues. And that's exactly how I started my activism on these issues. But I'd like to say a little bit about even on activism around child marriage. We, in 1998, started conversations around the Forum on Marriage and the Rights of Women and Girls. And it was 6 organizations who were concerned that we were repeatedly seeing child mothers, child brides in our organizations, but we were not doing much about it. Or, you know, there wasn't interest in taking this issue forward. So our voices and our efforts to do research and to approach UNICEF really sparked off the engagement. And I was so excited when we had the first declaration on child marriage, which was in 2003. And we called it the Ouagadougou. If you don't know Ouagadougou, that's in Burkina Faso in West Africa. That's when we really called the issue that people used to refer to it as, you know, early marriage, and, you know, and we said, no, any marriage of a child under 18 is a child, and we should name it as it is. And that's when people started picking up, an international community started picking up using child marriage rather than early marriage. So it's exciting to now see that child marriage is on the global agenda. Girls Not Brides has taken it further. And we're seeing a number of organizations pledging to take this forward. So that's a little bit, in a nutshell, how I came into this activism and really became part of the UK, I would say, UK Child Mothers Network, Child Marriage Network, which helped to bring the change in the law on child marriage in the UK.
And we'll come a little bit back to explore issues on the UK and the US, but that's a life endeavor on these topics, and you know, and it's one of those interesting things in gender-based violence where, you know, hopefully within a lifetime you can see that big, you know, that shift on starting to talk about something and hopefully, you know, diminish quickly within time, which, you know, is not always the case. But just for anybody who's kind of listening to us, 650 million women who are alive today were actually married as children. This is a huge number, Nana. And I think it's one of those things that are probably not spoken that often or minimized often within the gender-based violence spectrum of issues that we talk about. Start telling us what you've seen in cases. What is the real impact on girls' life who actually married, you know, early?
Thank you, Pamela. I think I'll go back to actually say even the statistics that we use, it's almost always an underestimated statistic because the data often doesn't capture the reality, particularly in rural areas and urban areas. So I'll always say that when we take this data, we need to take it with a pinch of salt, and the problem is much bigger. Primarily because, you know, a lot of our countries, particularly in African countries, you know, the data isn't consistently collected or collated for that matter. And so we need to also push for data collection to be a part of our change. But yes, child marriage is a huge, firstly, it's a public health issue. It's a public health issue because it impacts on girls and young women in a very dramatic way. And it's a human rights violation, and that is really accepted everywhere, that it is a human rights violation. But really creating child mothers when girls are least ready to shoulder this responsibility is totally wrong. And so we see that girls can marry as early as 12 years, 13 years, 14 years. And shortly after that, they are put under pressure, have no choice in decision-making around when to have sex, when to have children, etc. So they rapidly become mothers, and they see them having successive pregnancies as a result of their not having control in decision-making around either using contraception. So all these barriers and challenges compounds their situation. So we see that with child marriage and child brides, it creates challenges around sexual and reproductive health. Girls are more likely to experience difficulties in childbirth, which then means that we're seeing, and the data shows that maternal mortality of girls and who have children under 19, they are more than 5 times more likely to die than those who have children above 19 or 18 years. So clearly there is a consequence on a country and its impact on the number of girls or women who die during childbirth. And then there's also those who do not die but suffer huge consequences, including things like obstetric fistula, where the girls are forced, by the pelvic not grown enough. It means that there is a tear between the vagina, a wall, and the rectum, which then requires girls to continue to either, not be able to control their urine, or between the vagina wall and the bladder wall. So there's a lot of urine, there's a lot of feces. Some even have both. And that's a real big challenge. And recently, it's really become part of the work of UNFPA to tackle obstetric fistula. But in addition to that, there is these issues around the mental health trauma, challenges around psychological well-being for girls, and there is the impact on the children of child mothers. Can you imagine? I mean, a child, I always give my story. I had my first daughter at 24 years, and by my daughter at 9 months had measles. And wherever I went, I was told that, oh, don't bath her, don't do this, don't do that. And I was working in an area where I was educated, I'd finished university. I had a book where it's called Where There's No Doctor. And what I did was to refer to the pages on what to do when a child has measles. Today, my daughter is 41. She is giving me 2 beautiful grandchildren, which I love. Now, if I was a 12-year-old girl, that child would have died. So there is the issue of even children of child mothers dying early. So mortality is not just around the mothers, but the children of child mothers as well. So it's a lesson for us to learn about these issues. So yes, there is a bit around health, but there is also the big bit around poverty and education. Most girls who are forced into child marriage are girls who come from poor rural areas. Yes, there are some rich people who would also marry their girls early, particularly to keep the family wealth within the family. But majority of girls are from rural areas who have less opportunity and are vulnerable. So we are seeing that, and most are also poor. So you see that intergenerational cycle of poverty. The mother married early, the daughter marries early, the grandchildren are going to also marry as children. So this creates a cycle of poverty. And this means that people are not able to thrive or flourish or have economic growth. And we know that it impacts even on a nation at a higher level. Then there is a bit around education. Either girls are not taken into school or they are pulled out of school. And for a lot of girls, I've just come back from Sierra Leone, and once you go through FGM, and FGM really costs families no longer have the money or even the will to take their daughters back to school. So it technically means that girls will be married off. And so if you haven't finished your education, which means most girls who would be forced would not be in education or will be pulled out of education. So it's a huge loss. And from my experience, you know that the higher your level of education, the more likely you're able to thrive, able to have economic opportunities, but also have the necessary networks which you can fall on when things are hard. So it's really important that we tackle all these issues around child marriage and to address the deeply rooted challenges. And most importantly for me, it creates gender inequality. You know, lack of decision-making powers, inability to even have a voice, inability to contribute effectively into your community, your home. That in itself disempowers a lot of women. And we know that the UN Sustainable Development Goals really talks about child marriage and FGM and other forms of domestic abuse as a violation. And we know that the more girls who are married early are more likely to also experience abuse in their relationships. In some communities, you actually see that when a girl is pregnant, she's actually forced to also marry the perpetrator. What does this really mean? I mean, starting your life with a criminal who violated your rights. How are you going to even have any rights within that relationship? So we really have huge challenges when it comes to child marriage and the impact of this on girls, their children, the community, and the country at large.
And Nana, I'm gonna pick up so many points from that. You know that. You know it's coming. Let's talk a little bit about data collection. Because one of the things that we hear most often is, apart from obviously just poor data collection in some areas, is also the fact that many marriages are not registered. Or these unions happen with consent from the families until maybe if it is a country where there is a law, let's say, and the fact is that legally also there's a lot of countries, including the US, where there I think 20 states have like a 12-year-old can actually get married. So there is a lot of this not registering marriages, so the scale of the problem can just be off the roof.
Yes. I think it's really important, like I said about data collection, you would find that it's quite easy to falsify, birth certificates, because in the first place, for a lot of girls in communities that we come from, there's no birth certificate at birth. And so there isn't even the evidence to prove that you're a certain age. And if you want to prove it, you can easily get any birth certificate. So there is falsification of birth certificate to make things possible. But there is also a lot of marriages that are not registered, especially customary marriages, religious marriages are not really registered. And it's on the onus on terms of data collection to really capture some of these data, and very often it's not captured effectively. Because of that, we are increasingly seeing that for some of the girls, even the way the marriage is done, the ceremonies may be done differently, and it will be done in such a way that sometimes it's a number of girls who are, taken into the ceremony around the marriage at the community level. And also sometimes the girl is just carried away to the man's home, and so there are a lot of different permutations on how child marriage happens. But data collection, especially in schools, and I would say that schools form a really good source of data collection, particularly to see girls in school. And you find that where even the data is collected, there isn't any analysis of the data to really even look at trends. I got a good example of a school we went to where the headmaster had proudly put on his wall, children in, let's say, class 1 to maybe standard 1 to about standard 5. And you'll find that in standard 1, there will be like maybe 200 males and maybe 160 girls. And then by the time they go to standard 5, you'll find that the males will be like 50 and then girls will be about 10. So clearly something has happened along the way and girls have dropped out, either through teenage pregnancy, through child marriage, but nobody's taking this data and really analyzing and asking the questions and following up. So there are different ways in which you can collect the data, but how you use the data, how you analyze it and creatively use it for decision making is lacking in a lot of countries that we work in.
And the reason that I'm kind of dying on this point is for anybody who's hearing us, who might think, pretty much if there was a law that prohibited this, then it wouldn't happen. And that's not the case, because we see people that are happy with religious ceremonies, for example, to get a couple of young children married and wait legally until the age. Can we talk a little bit about your opinion on the difference between the age of marriage and the age of consent?
It's interesting. In a number of countries, there is no difference between the age of marriage and the age of consent, because technically you can only consent when you're married. So the age of marriage is technically the same. But reality is that for a lot of countries, the age of consent is often lower. That's consent to sex or consent to marriage. Which one are we talking about? Mm-hmm. Is it a consent to marriage or consent to sex? Mm-hmm. So in the issue of consent to sex, you'd find that a lot of times maybe the age of consent would be 16 and the age of marriage would be about 18. But technically, I mean, if a child is under 18, technically she cannot consent to marriage. Mm-hmm. And it's a real challenge, although at the same time, we know that some girls would be matured enough between maybe 17 onwards to want to really make a decision to marry. And in a number of cases, even in the communities that we worked in, we actually found that some girls were happy to marry or happy to go and cohabit, because again, we have a lot of people who will cohabit with a man technically being married, but are not necessarily legally married for that matter. Mm-hmm. And a lot of girls choose to cohabit primarily because they are not happy in their homes. They are not getting access to, money and resources and all those kinds of things that will make them independent, and maybe feel that when they get married or when they get a cohabit with a man, that would help. In a lot of these cases, the girls may consent to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the freedom of being wives. So there are issues, again, even those who freely consent. But I think the consent matter is really, really a big, big issue, which we have to really have more nuanced understanding, but also to discuss these issues in education and for girls to really understand the difference around these issues, whether you're consenting, how can you consent when you do not have the right information and knowledge about these issues to go into a marriage.
And it's important because it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so I want to, and it is important that we see child marriage. I think us who work in this space and talk about this issue, understand it and see it that way. But why should we alarm or highlighting the issue of child marriage during Sexual Assault Awareness Month?
I think it's really important we recognize that. I see that for every girl who marries below the age of consent, below the age of 18, personally, she's almost daily raped. Because, what does rape mean? It's about consent to have sexual relation. You didn't even consent to the marriage. How do you technically consent to continue to have sexual relations with this man throughout your life? There is also the fact that I always see that we need to recognize the intersectionality of all these forms of violence. And very often we just look at, these forms of violence in silos. They are all intersectional, because when you look at a number of the girls that we have worked with at community level, a lot of them are forced into marriage, maybe because she had been sexually abused. Mm-hmm. And she's pregnant. And to address the shame, the families then go and mediate with the perpetrator, the criminal, to basically accept this woman and marry her, to save the family, the shame of the family, the honor of the family. And this means that the girl is going into a relationship where she knows that she is definitely going to experience years and years of abuse. And this is, a sad challenge. In some countries, you'd find that the age of statutory rape is technically any, they call it defilement of girls under 18 years. But at the same time, if you are married under 18 years, it's not seen as statutory rape because it's legally married, whether it's religious marriage or whether it is a customary marriage. So even the laws are very much contradictory when it comes to this. There are challenges between the religious laws, the customary laws, as well as the civil laws. So all this makes it really difficult. But it's a good opportunity in Sexual Assault Week to really talk about all forms of abuse, because having relations with a woman that didn't consent to marry you and having sex for girls, it's really child abuse. It's a constant form of child abuse. And we need to recognize that daily. And yes, even if you consent to have relations, it doesn't mean that you want to consent every day, and it's something that we have to repeatedly take all opportunities to put this issue on the agenda.
You spoke about breaking the cycle, which is very important, especially when trying to look for a solution, a global solution to these problems, right? And we know that this is an intergenerational problem too, for the reasons that you kind of have highlighted. I guess I really want to talk a little bit about education, which you spoke, because we keep on seeing on development goals from, the Millennium Development Goals back in the day to the SDGs now, how we keep on talking about education for girls. And I think, especially in Western countries, there's a kind of an understanding that this is a good idea because it just seems fair. But actually, it has many more consequences than just, the fairness of access to education, right? It actually has the power of preventing sexual violence and other issues. So I would like to get a bit more of your take on education against another issue that you brought up, which was poverty, right? And how they relate, and why is it vital that we really, support this type of programming?
To be honest, there was a time when they said primary education was the most important for girls. Now, evidence is showing that secondary education is the best for girls, and girls who go as far as secondary education are more likely to go into relationships in a more matured way, have the skills, be more prepared, have also the social networks that they would need in their future journeys as mothers, into careers, etc. Education is vital. And the data from Girls Not Brides is actually showing that the longer a girl stays in education, the less likely she'll be forced into marriage. And so there is an onus on the government who want to address this issue to try to keep girls in education. Unfortunately, there's been quite a lot of issues around, another element around this education is the whole issue of teenage pregnancy and the barriers to teenage pregnant girls, as well as child mothers returning to school. A lot of times once you're pregnant, you're completely barred from school, and there isn't opportunities for you to return. And we know that for girls who have children early, they are more likely to have more repeated pregnancies and have less spacing within these pregnancies, which then means that they are put at more risk on mortality. And so education, but again, education is important, but it doesn't only give you the skills, especially if you get good education. But we now know that in a lot of the schools, actually, girls go to education and come out and really don't know why they went to school because they don't get much of it. So much out of education. So we do also need to look at quality education and not just education in terms of, going in and coming out without really. And we know that for a lot of girls who go to school, they are less likely to benefit from school because of the additional triple burden of being girls, the chores that they have to do at home, not being able to do their homework and all those barriers. So it's important that for girls to really get benefits out of education, they also need to address the barriers that girls face in schools. For a lot of girls, secondary education may not even be close in their communities. So they may have to travel to go to secondary schools. That puts them, even the distance to go to school puts them at additional risk. So all these issues, I think governments should need to acknowledge these challenges and ensure that girls have the opportunity to be in school. A big issue for girls in going and staying, particularly in secondary education, is menstruation. I mean, we are in Europe. For a lot of us, menstruation it's an issue that we talk about and we know, and it's not a barrier. For a lot of girls, menstruation means that you miss so many days in school because you don't either have the pad, the support, etc. And 4 or 5 days in a month, you are actually out of school. And for some of the girls, this also becomes a way in which they drop out of school. Even some girls have sexual relations with men in order to buy pads, etc., and put them at additional risk. So we have to empower girls, and education for girls it needs to create those spaces for them to be able to be supported effectively. So girls' education is important, but we need to explore the right education, give them the additional security and support so that they can also complete the education.
It's interesting that we're starting to talk about governments and government's roles and how this is a political issue, as many issues that relate to gender-based violence.
Yes.
Just to kind of give you the state's example, girls are getting married as young as 10 years old. In the last decade, it's over 300,000 girls that we know have been married. Imagine what that number would probably really look like. There is no protective federal law in over 20 states. And in 10 states, there's actually no limit to marry of age. So that is the situation of the United States. We know the United Kingdom recently went through, law changes. So I would love you to talk a little bit about maybe a little bit about governments and their lack of political will to tackle this issue in some countries, and also the case example of the UK. How did we manage to kind of break that barrier here?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because the UK came at the problem of child marriage primarily through forced marriage. Mm-hmm. So there was a big issue of girls being removed from the UK, taken back to countries of origin to be married, and then bringing back their spouses, which was almost always the case. And as part of the work on the Forum on Marriage and the Rights of Women and Girls, that is when the UK government, we did some advocacy with the UK government, and they started taking this issue seriously and set up the Forum on the Forced Marriage Unit. So as a forced marriage unit at that time, it was really concerned about girls being taken out of the country. So there was also a lot of government guidance, statutory guidance, which was provided. Training went alongside it. There was efforts by immigration officers, to be trained. And the special, I would say, forced marriage unit really also demonstrated the seriousness of the UK government to tackle the issue of forced marriage. And what was then happening was that a number of UK organizations, particularly South Asian organizations, were very instrumental also in taking up advocacy work, working in schools, tackling it from the point of view of not only looking at forced marriage, but also honor-based abuse. So there was a wider issue around not just forced marriage, but honor-based abuse. The UK government at the same time was also quite adamant around pushing the age of marriage in international development to 18. And, in 2014, where David Cameron organized the Girls' Summit, it was really focused on child marriage and female genital mutilation. And they were very clear around tackling these two issues. So right from that time, the UK government wanted to see child marriage as an issue of international development. At the same time, In the UK, it was okay to marry at 16 years with parental, consent and legal consent, etc. So I would say one of the organizations that really tried to push initially was the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Population and Reproductive Health. And they actually organized a series of consultations, I would say a global consultation, bringing people in parliament to really talk about this issue of child marriage, and made recommendations to the UK government to also amend the age of marriage. So there was also the pressure from the All-Party Parliamentary Group. But then there was also pressure from the civil society organizations. Forward was one of the organizations at the time where we were part of the UK chapter on girls not brides. And that became our main push for the UK government to amend the law and bring it at par with other countries. In Europe, you would find that, the age of marriage is automatically 18 for a lot of countries. So it was important that UK really took strategic steps. But it took a very long time. It took more than 5 years to really work on this campaign. But the issue of a joint approach, working with legal, we also had quite a lot of legal experts, Naomi Weissman, and others, were really instrumental. We had ICRO, we had Carmen Navarna bringing in, and it was a good group of, women organizations working on the issues. We had the Yemeni Association, so that then meant that we were able to come with one voice to push. And working with Baroness Latham was actually very strategic and providing her with information, resources. We also had an amazing, I would say, Penzi was really, really good. She had an experience and showing her lived experience, being the advocate of the campaign, was quite instrumental in bringing in lived experience and using that as part of the campaign. And the all-party group also picked it up. Baroness Sag was part of the campaign. And so after years of pushing, and these kinds of campaigns, very often you feel it's, you're exhausted, it's not happening. But then we also had the UK government, and when it went into parliament, there was really no dissent, and everybody was quite pleased to have it, because I think that the timing was right. And sometimes, when the timing isn't right, it becomes really challenging. But I think the US has to get its act together, because they need to take strategic action. And I think they have coalitions, and the coalitions are pushing for change. It needs to, it takes a long time, but we shouldn't give up. They shouldn't give up, because change does happen.
Nana, and I think you've highlighted something that is you and I always talk about this, that is very important for us. That is a classical example about partnership work within this sector and the political spectrum actually working. And I think for any government or any NGO that is out there, we just, making sure that everybody's working and pushing on the same direction is really important, isn't it?
Oh, clearly. We always say that you can't use one finger to clasp. You have to use both hands to clasp and get a tight grip. And they said that, African proverbs, when spider webs work together, they can weave a web around lions and can make a change. And so it's really important to see that this is an issue. Child marriage is an endemic issue. It's widespread, and it's a problem that one organization cannot tackle. Even where we know where there have been laws that have been passed, it's not as strong if there isn't the local groundswell of action to make it happen. So yes, partnerships are important because there are multiple drivers. Bringing in religious leaders, bringing in community leaders, women organizations, bringing in education sector. If a teacher is determined to keep a girl in school. She can go to the home, even if the girl refuses to come to school. So we know that where we have teachers who are motivated, we have community organizations coming together is really important. And that's the beauty of partnership. Small organizations, big organizations, everybody has something to give. Everybody has something to bring. And together we should be able to make a change happen. But partnerships aren't easy. And for a lot of times, and that's where we found with the partnership that we had on the Forum on Marriage and the Rights of Women and Girls, we didn't have a lot of political power at the time. And we also realized that for a number of the members who had joined, also didn't have decision-making powers. So when we made decision within the forum and they went back to the organizations, there wasn't commitment by the organizations. So when it comes to these kind of partnership working, it's important that there is senior decision-making capacity and ability within the partnerships to make things go and to make things be implemented. Otherwise, you just go talking, and come back without any actions being taken. So leadership is really important, and leadership organizations should lend their authority to any of these partnerships in order for it to be effective. But we also have to recognize that, partnerships takes effort. It takes resources for a lot of people to come into these kinds of partnerships. It really requires training. And somebody has to fund the training, somebody has to resource, somebody has to conduct the research. So it's important that we look at strengths of different organizations and bring these things into fruition. But it has to be coordinated, it has to be resourced, and it really have to be clear that you have a similar vision. A lot of times people come into partnerships with different visions. I want this bit of it. I want that bit of it. That doesn't make collective decision making and change. So it's really important that we have that kind of, you don't come as me, you come as our, that kind of our change. It's a together work and not just my individual organization. You have to lose your individual identities in order to make this work.
Thank you for reminding us that partnerships are just not a will thing. It's also much more than will, skills, funding capacity, aligning strategies, etc. We have a question just before we start closing down, and it is around birth control. I think the availability of it for young women, or does the lack of birth control, let me twist it a little bit, also forms part of that kind of package of abuse in a way that goes against these girls?
The interesting thing about birth control is that for a lot of girls, they do not have the power to make decisions around use of contraception, even accessing services, and decisions are either made by their in-laws or by their husbands for that matter, or their partners for that matter. So decision-making around contraceptive use or even negotiating contraceptive use is really huge. So for a lot of girls, you'd find that they would, I would say, clandestine use. I've worked in northern Ghana where you've had situations where people would rather come in and take the injection rather than, ask the husband to really use condoms or that kind of thing. And so we need to look also at the situation of girls and young women and explore how we can support them best. A lot of communities too, they frown upon girls accessing contraceptives and, sexual and reproductive health, even information. And without accessing information and services, we find that, for the girls who are even in marriage, they are not able to negotiate the pacing of their spacing of their children. And that is a big challenge. Sexual and reproductive health providers are also not necessarily that friendly to young women. So the element around youth-friendly services is also lacking. And you'd go to a service and you go and meet your auntie there who is either going for the service or she has, all those things makes it difficult for girls to be able to access. But I think we also need to recognize that men play a critical role. And very often we let men out. When it comes to contraception, men need to be responsible for contraception. It shouldn't always
Absolutely.
be the responsibility of girls and young women. So we have to also push for action for men and partners. I mean, I know that some organizations work with, fathers groups and things, and to bring these things to fathers or husbands for that, but they call them husband schools, to really understand the situation of girls or their wives for that matter, and to support them better. So contraception is important. Access to services is really, really critical for girls
And
and young women. Yeah.
Nana, I mean, tell us a little bit of Forward and the services that you provide. Nationally, we're getting questions about the extent of the support that is provided within the UK. Have somebody from Derbyshire, for example, making a comment like, tell us about Forward, the services that it provides within the United Kingdom, and also we're probably going to get a couple of resources from you to send everybody about Forward. So please.
Good. And for us, we tackle multiple forms of abuse, like I say, because our approach on this is really trauma informed, and then knowing that girls have had a traumatic experience through the marriage. I mean, a lot of girls, really are traumatized when they get married, and don't even understand the issue about having to have sexual relations. So there is the issue about trauma and supporting, particularly in Forward. We are providing culturally appropriate services. We are increasingly seeing young women who would come in because they've been married as spouses, and some would be very young, or some would come in, they were married young before they came in, so they also have the trauma of having married early. And then they come in here, and then there's the issue of domestic abuse, there's the issue of, not understanding the language and being able to access services, and not being able to access mainstream services. So our services are tailored towards, women from disadvantaged communities, African women. We provide them counseling, we provide them safe space, but also we do a lot of coffee mornings to bring women together to talk to other women and experience. Like, for example, today, one of the things that we did was a community hub, a program where we brought, and we know that in Sudan, there is a big issue. We have a number of women that we work with who are from Sudan. And we organized a community hub and solidarity with Sudanese women, and to really come together to have, talking about resilience, talking about, building back our resources and well-being and what needs to be done. So it's important we adopt different strategies. One of the things that we have seen has been really important is our Community Champions program, where we train community champions from affected communities to be advocates for change. We train them on skills building, giving them tools, and giving them the network, an opportunity to be able to reach out and do outreach in their own communities. Because tackling these issues requires really tackling the social norms and drivers. And without creating the spaces for these conversations, we will still not be able to get people on our side in stopping I would say, the cycle of abuse. So it's important that we work with, we also do quite a lot of partnership working, providing statutory organizations with training and understanding these issues so that they can respond better to the needs of women and girls. In our Africa program, we do a lot of work around partnership, supporting young women-led organizations to have the skills, to have the resources, and also to have the opportunities to engage and build and work better with young people. So young women's leadership is a really strategic element of our work, and ensuring that young women are trained and understand how to undertake activism within their peer group, but also within their communities.
And we will be putting this video in YouTube. So we'll put links also to the work and to your work, and you're in the UK, because again, we're getting more. Just a final question in the last minute that we have or so. Child marriage, it happens all over the world in different ways, usually because of small customs They take multiple forms, right?
Yes.
In different communities, they have a tradition or a custom, and that's why there's an excuse, a way to excuse this always in many places. What do we do against customary traditions to really try to win this battle, Nana, in
I
practice?
think the customary, one of the ways we have to really understand is to work with the custodians of the customary laws. And the custodians of the customary laws would be religious leaders, would be traditional leaders, and also with women who have influence on the ground. Because without them being being on our side and being partners, we need to collaborate with them, give them the information. For a lot of them, they don't even understand the challenges that these child brides experience, and to be able to give them that understanding. And a lot of times also using religious texts to actually justify that it's wrong, it's a human rights violation, and really getting voices of girls and young women. And that's one of the things we did in Tanzania, where we did research and created a platform for girls to engage with policymakers, decision makers at the rural level, to really share their experience and what other girls. And that was a really game changer for them to actually start to really realize that there were challenges that these girls were experiencing, because a lot of them, they thought that, oh, girls were safe within marriage and better than those who were not married. So we do need to work with religious leaders. We need to challenge some of these religious customs around, for example, mediation and the harms that it causes communities, and to really break some of these barriers. And I'm glad that we are seeing a shift. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. We're seeing a shift in some countries, South Asia in particular. There is, huge shifts coming in reducing, but the numbers are still huge when it comes to the numbers. Around 700 million girls are supposed to. The numbers are just mind-boggling, and we all need to collectively really think about how we can make girls to have opportunities that we have, to be able to grow and thrive, and to be able to make decisions with the information, education, and equipped with skills that will make them to become change makers in their communities. We all need to make that effort. Yeah.
Nana, thank you so much. You are, one of my favorite people ever to talk to. Not only as a great leader on this space, but also as a woman, as a leader, as a champion, and as a great example for all of us. So thank you so much for being with us, and for everybody who joined. As I said before, we're going to be putting some clips online, so please share the message as much as you can, and we'll also put the full conversation out on YouTube. We'll share that with everybody through an email who have attended or signed in today. Thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure being with you, Pamela, and to really talk about these issues. Thank you to those who joined, and really come on board. Let's make effort together to really break the barriers and break the chains and make girls become girls and not brides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've accomplished a lot over the last 10 years together. The awareness and understanding of domestic and sexual violence has increased, and the stigma around speaking out has decreased. Survivor voices have been amplified, and we've built a global community and engaged millions of bystanders to be a part of the solution. But across the world, many things have not improved, and in some ways have even gotten worse. Domestic and sexual violence is still at epidemic levels. Advances in technology and social media present new challenges to safety and online abuse. Women's rights are under attack in many places, and resources to stop and prevent violence have been cut or stretched to the breaking point. 10 years is not enough. We need more. More respect, more inclusion, more unity, more progress, more action. More, no more. No more. Together we can end domestic and sexual violence.